They marched as conquerors. They froze as statues. 15,000 survivors of Napoleon's Grande Armée, trapped in a blizzard so fierce it turned men into monuments. The soldiers who once burned Moscow now fought their own fire, the cold. Muskets shattered when cocked, boot soles froze to the ground, and beside every dying man stood a horse that would never fall. 100,000 animals, locked in place by the frost, eyes open, breath crystallized mid-air. Entire columns turned to glass beneath the snow. No drums, no shouting, just the sound of wind moving through the dead. This wasn't a defeat by men or by armies, it was a defeat by winter itself, the moment the greatest force in Europe learned what the cold could conquer. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte led the greatest army Europe had ever seen. 600,000 men drawn from every corner of his empire. They crossed into Russia with banners high, music playing, and a single promise: the war would be over before winter. It wasn't. After months of marching, the army reached its prize, Moscow, only to find it empty. The city burned itself to deny him shelter. The flames consumed food, clothing, and fuel. Victory became a trap. When the order to retreat came in October, the army began its long march west. The temperature fell below freezing in days. Roads vanished under snow. Horses collapsed where they stood, and wagons froze to the earth. Among them was Captain Henri Delacroix, a French officer of the Imperial Guard. He'd seen battle from Spain to Poland, but never an enemy like this. He wrote later, "We marched in silence because the cold stole our voices. The Grande Armée that entered Russia as a sea of sound now moved like ghosts through a white desert. Every mile west was a mile deeper into death. The same discipline that once conquered Europe was breaking one frozen step at a time. By November, the retreat had become a race against extinction. The temperature fell to -30. Frost formed inside rifles. Leather straps froze solid and snapped like glass. The men had no tents left, no fires strong enough to burn through the wind. They wrapped themselves in rags torn from uniforms and in the hides of the horses that had carried them. But the warmth they found was deadly. Sweat froze against skin. Bodies overheated under layers, then froze from within when the steam turned to ice. Every movement carried risk, even breathing. When they inhaled too deeply, the cold burned their lungs raw. Dozens fell in silence, faces turned blue before they hit the ground. Captain Delacroix wrote of men trying to light fires with frozen hands, of sparks dying before the flames could breathe. He said the night itself seemed alive, like an enemy that pressed its weight upon our chests. The horses, once the pride of the cavalry, began to die in lines, their bodies stiff before they touched the snow. Some froze standing, harnessed to wagons they could no longer pull, their hooves fused to the ground by their own melted breath. In 2 weeks, 30,000 animals were lost. Without them, the guns could not move. Without the guns, the army could no longer fight. And so the empire that had conquered Europe began to crawl, step by step, through a land that killed faster than any bullet. The cold didn't kill the horses all at once. It took them piece by piece, breath first, then movement, then memory. Every morning, more were found standing still, eyes glazed in frost, manes stiff with ice. They had frozen where they stood, mid-step, mid-breath, an army turned into statues of bone and snow. Eyewitnesses spoke of fields filled with thousands of them, horses locked in harnesses, their bodies rigid against the wind. Some still tethered to wagons, others collapsed beside their riders, their faces pressed into the same snow that buried them both. Captain Delacroix described it as a graveyard without sound. He said the wind moved through the frozen animals and made a sound like whispering. He couldn't tell if it was real or only in his head. The loss broke more than the army's strength. It broke its will. The cavalry was gone. The artillery left behind, swallowed by the frost. Without horses, they could not move the guns, the food, the wounded. Without the horses, the men had nothing left to follow but the road and their own breath. At night, they burned saddles and wooden wheels for warmth. By morning, they carved frozen meat from the animals that had once carried them into battle. Some wept while they did it. Others no longer remembered why it mattered. The landscape of the retreat became a museum of failure, 1,000 frozen monuments to ambition, glistening under a sun that gave no heat. By the time they reached the Berezina, the army no longer looked like an army. It was a procession of shadows moving through white silence, each step echoing across the bones of the ones that couldn't follow. When the horses were gone, the men began to die like them, slowly, quietly, standing. Frostbite claimed them in layers. Fingers turned black, then snapped at the joints. Faces split open where the wind struck hardest. Some soldiers tied their hands to their muskets so they wouldn't lose them when they fell asleep. Most never woke again. The road west became a line of corpses, men frozen in the act of marching, heads bowed, rifles slung over shoulders. They looked alive until you got close enough to see the eyes. Captain Delacroix wrote that the silence was worse than the cold. He said, "We stopped speaking because words froze in the air." Even the sound of gunfire had vanished. There were no more battles to fight, only distance to die in. In burned-out villages, soldiers tore down icons and wooden doors for firewood. Churches glowed for a moment in the dark, then disappeared into ash. Faith was traded for heat. The men began to move differently, slower, quieter, as if afraid to disturb the snow. Their eyes were empty, their pace mechanical. Some walked until their legs locked and froze straight, bodies left upright like memorials. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were relics in motion, remnants of an army that refused to admit it had already died. No one gave orders now. No one saluted. The Grande Armée was gone, and what remained of it moved through the storm like ghosts chasing the memory of warmth. At the end of November, what remained of Napoleon's army reached the Berezina River. It was the last barrier between them and survival. Behind them, the Russians. Before them, a river half frozen, deep and merciless. Engineers worked through the night to build bridges. They used cannon wheels as supports, ripped wagons for timber, and burned their last supplies for light. When dawn came, the frost had turned their tools to stone. Still, they built, not for glory, but to live another hour. On November 26th, the first wave crossed. The river groaned beneath their weight. Men, horses, and wagons fought to stay on the planks as ice shattered underfoot. Some fell through, dragged down by their own armor, disappearing under the black water. Others froze before they reached the opposite bank, statues forming mid-crossing. Captain Delacroix wrote of the screams, thousands of voices rising together, then swallowed by wind. He saw a cavalry horse try to leap across a break in the bridge, its body freezing solid before it hit the other side. For 2 days, chaos reigned. The rear guard held the Russians at bay, their muskets barely firing, their hands too numb to reload. Frost and smoke blurred everything into one color, gray. By the time the bridges collapsed, tens of thousands were gone. The Berezina didn't just swallow an army. It erased the idea of empire. Every man who crossed left something behind, a weapon, a horse, a part of himself that never thawed. Those who made it across looked back and saw nothing but white. The world behind them had disappeared, and what lay ahead was only more cold. When the survivors reached safety, they were unrecognizable. Not as soldiers, not even as men, but as fragments of something that had once believed itself immortal. Out of 600,000 who entered Russia, fewer than 30,000 returned. The rest were left scattered across the white silence, the price of one man's certainty. Europe had watched the emperor conquer every enemy before him: Austria, Prussia, Spain. But this time, no nation had defeated him. It was nature. The Russian winter had done what no army could. In Paris, painters would later turn the retreat into legend, heroic scenes of loyalty and endurance. But the letters tell another story. Men crawling through snow, eating leather and bark, cursing the name they once cheered. Historians would call it Napoleon's greatest mistake. But to the men who walked through that storm, it wasn't strategy that failed. It was faith. Faith in a man, in an empire, in the idea that the human will could defy the earth itself. Even the emperor understood it. When he returned to Paris, he told his ministers, "The army is gone." He didn't blame the enemy. He blamed the weather. But behind that word, weather, was judgment. The frost had stripped away every illusion of power, leaving only the truth. No empire, no genius, no god of war can command the cold. When spring returned to Russia, the snow began to melt, and with it, the truth of what had happened. Villagers found horses still harnessed to wagons, frozen in place. They found soldiers standing upright in the drifts, muskets clutched to their chests, eyes open as if still waiting for orders. The cold had preserved them, turning death into memory. The French buried what they could, but most were left where they fell. The land itself became their tomb. Even now, 2 centuries later, archaeologists still uncover bones along the route. Rings, buttons, shards of uniform, and horseshoes fused with frost. Each fragment tells the same story, of an army that believed it could conquer the world and found instead that the world had no need to fight back. In the end, no empire fell that winter. It simply froze, suspended in a silence deeper than defeat. The men who survived carried that silence with them for the rest of their lives, and when they spoke of it, they said only one thing: the cold remembers. And so, across the plains of Russia, the ghosts of the Grande Armée still stand, frozen not in glory, but in regret.